Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the fourth of our Town Forest Recreation Planning webinar series. My name is Kate Four, and I'm the Community Forestry Specialist with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We have quite a few of our friends of the program on the webinar today, but for those of you who are new to us, the UCF team is a collaboration between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. We provide technical, educational, and financial assistance to communities in stewarding their tree resources. You can find out more about us and our program at vtcommunityforestry.org. This webinar series is part of our Vermont Town Forest Recreation Planning Initiative. For more information about the project and access to our online toolkit that offers everything you need to develop a town forest recreation plan for your community, that's from start to finish, go to vtcommunityforestry.org/town forest toolkit. We'll include the link to the toolkit in the chat box after we get started here. A few logistics before we begin the presentation. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation, and there is no video option for participants. However, we would love to hear from you. Please use the question box in the side panel. Questions will be addressed throughout the presentation, if appropriate, or at the end, depending on the content. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at vtcommunityforestry.org later today. My UCF program teammate, Gwen Kozlowski, will be emailing out a link to those who have registered for the webinar, a link to the recording, I should say, for those who have registered for the webinar. And at the end of the webinar today, you will receive a pop-up window of a survey from GoToWebinar. Please take a few minutes to share your feedback on the webinar or any suggestions for future topics so that we can plan for more opportunities in the future. Today's webinar is Trail Building and Maintenance. We are delighted to have so many of you on the webinar today. I think it really speaks to both the interest and the need around trails in Vermont town forests. Today's webinar is being co-presented by Kathryn Wrigley and Luke O'Brien, who are forest recreation specialists with the Vermont Department of Forest Recreation. Vermont Department of Forest Recreation, Parks and Recreation. I guess the heat is getting to me. Thank you so much to Kathryn and Luke for joining us today and sharing their expertise. Before I hand it over to them, Gwen has a few polls to help us get started and understand a little bit more about the audience. Gwen, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got a few polls here just to see who's in the audience. The first is to get a sense of where are folks located. We have about 40 or so people logging on right now. I'm curious to see where you are. We'll have about 20 seconds or so on this poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this. It looks like a lot of people were able to respond. We've got 21% outside of Vermont, 32% in southern Vermont, 15% in central Vermont, 24% in northwest Vermont, and a handful from Northeast Kingdom. Excellent. Let's see, our next question is, what is your experience with trail work? I'm brand new, 1 to 2 years experience, 2 to 5, or 5+. I'll go ahead and leave this poll open for another 10 to 15 seconds. Boy, you guys are filling in the polls fast. This is great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this one. It looks like we are evenly split with about 30% brand new, 30% 1 to 2, and 30% 5+ years experience, with just a few people of the 2 to 5 years. So a nice mix across all of those categories. And the next poll, in your community, are you looking to create new trails, maintain established trails, both, or I'm just here to learn a little bit more to get started? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in about 5 seconds. Okay. About half of you say both. They're here to maintain and create. 10% are here to learn more to get started. 16% are here to create new trails, and 21% to maintain and establish trails. But I'd say the majority are here for both. And the last question is, please select 2 of the most prominent trail types and uses that you're working with: hiking and walking, biking, ADA accessible, motorized ATV use, or winter use and skiing. I'll leave this poll open again for another 10-15 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close this poll. 70% say winter use, 38% for biking, 95% hiking and walking, and just 3% for both ADA accessible and motorized ATV use. All right, well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about where you are and what your experiences are. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathryn and Luke.
All right, thanks, Gwen. This is Kathryn. We're going just voice today. Luke, do you want to say hi so they know what your voice sounds like?
Sure. Hi, folks. It's great to have you here and interesting to see those poll results. So hopefully we'll answer your questions, and if not, we'll have more resources at the end of the presentation, or you can feel free to reach out to us directly. Nice to be here.
Yeah, we're both excited to be here. We've worked in trails for a while and tried to distill sort of some of the basics of trail building and maintenance for all of you. And we're gonna start off with what we'll be covering today. Oop, hold on.
So this is not comprehensive, but these are the main topics that we're going to be addressing. The first is visioning and goal setting. The second is design and layout, how to properly create a new trail. Next is actual trail building techniques to make a trail that's sustainable and effective and fun. Signs and maps, we'll touch on that briefly. Trail maintenance, how to take care of your trail for the long haul. Sustainability. This involves both making trails that are sustainable on the landscape, but also a little bit of social sustainability in terms of how you engage volunteers and crews and again, manage trails for the long term. Safety is another important consideration. And lastly, resources. We have a list of resources, both literature and organizational, that we will provide at the end of the show. And I think that's it. So as we begin our presentation today, we wanted to remind folks to put their project into context. And it seems like we have a diversity of groups who are interested in both new and existing trails. So these may not be relevant to everybody, but it is important to think about how your trail system or your trail would fit into your town forest or your public property. And so we had a couple of questions here that we thought you might want to reflect upon. First, just thinking about what the general property personality is. What's the character of the land? Are there unique features that you want to highlight? Who owns and manages the property? Do you need special permissions or permits to do work there? What's the size of the parcel? Does it have capacity for a trail system, a large system or a small one, or something that connects onto other parcels nearby? What are the existing trail resources? And are there user demands, people who really want to have bike trails in your community or ski trails in your community? And how can the parcel and your efforts address those demands? Thinking about what use levels you might see on the property are important. That'll really dictate the extent to which you have to build out your trails to certain standards. Is there adequate access to the parcel? Do you have existing roads and parking areas, or do these need to be developed in addition to the trails? Who's going to build the trails? Who's going to maintain the trails? And is there community support to sustain that over the long term? So these are some questions just to reflect upon, maybe to have some early conversations with other trail builders in your community or the committee that you're on, whether it's a recreation committee or a conservation commission, just to put things into perspective. Next, we're going to talk about more of a landscape perspective, and Kathryn's going to talk about that.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, so Luke mentioned a handful of questions that sort of directly relate to your parcel, maybe who owns parcels next to you, what your parcel looks like in the larger landscape. And sort of one of the easiest ways to get a quick handle on that is by looking at your parcel on a map. And the FPR, Forest Parks and Recreation, has created A&R Atlas, which is a free tool that you can use to see your parcel in a landscape context. So as an example, I highlighted the Heinsberg Town Forest. And you can see when you highlight a parcel, it actually tells you all of this information that's over in this box. So the standardized parcel boundary, who owns it, how many acres it is. And then you can add layers onto it that will help you understand further some of the other questions like unique features, if there's other existing trails that maybe you want to hook into, roads, etc. So I added just a handful of layers in this other screenshot that I've just loaded. So again, you can see that I still have the Heinsberg Town Forest highlighted. And then there's sort of a light brown that's different shaped, and that's actually deer wintering lair area. And then the sort of very light green are wetlands. Those are two ecological features that often need to be avoided for certain trail building experiences. So you can also add in things like other trails and roads, etc. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what you can do with A&R Atlas. And there is more information on exactly how to use this in step 2 of the Town Forest Toolkit, which I think Kate mentioned in the beginning that they'll be sending you a link to. So now Luke is gonna talk about the vision and design process once you've checked out your context.
Sure, and I would add that the Atlas also has great information on where other public lands are surrounding your parcel. So if you're looking at connecting different parcels, that's a very helpful tool. So speaking of connecting, when we talk about the visioning and designing process, we use the term limiting factors, or some people call them control points. And these are really helpful at the outset as you imagine what your trail or trail system is going to look like. And essentially, the control points are dots on a map, and they are going to be features that you are going to work your trail around to either highlight or avoid. And so in this graphic, we're going to talk about some limiting factors. And these might include some things like wetlands, steep slopes, property boundaries, other conflicting uses, essential wildlife habitats that you might want to avoid, other parcel inholdings or strange boundary lines, or flat areas where water may not drain off. So those are all, I wouldn't call them negative features, but they're features that are gonna, again, limit where your trail goes and how it's constructed. And then you have supporting features, supporting control points. And these are gonna involve features that you want to highlight, and they're going to give good character to your trail. So that might include existing infrastructure. It might give you a head start on your project if you already have portions of existing trail or trails that you can tie into. Features like summits and vistas or outcroppings, other neat natural features. Junctions are an important control point, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, it's something that you need to work your trail design process around. And then other just scenic areas, and then areas that are easier to get to. Those are good starting points, and they're going to support your design process. And then lastly, there's kind of this sweet spot where there are both factors or control points that represent both. And you just have to give these due consideration just to make sure that you're addressing them correctly. And so these include some examples are trailheads. It's limiting because if you have an existing trailhead, that's where you're going to have to start, whether you want to or not. But it's also supporting if you have an existing trailhead, because that work is done for you and you can just start off laying out the rest of your trail. Again, stream crossings, they're both limiting in that you want to be very careful to protect water resources. And they're supporting because if you are looking at a stream and you find a good crossing site, that's a great place to put your trail through. And again, will help you in your planning phase. Natural areas, you know, some you're going to want to avoid, others you may want to highlight. But again, how you do that is determined by how sensitive they are and some of the other factors we'll talk about. Historic sites, in some cases, trails really want to highlight historic areas, pass next to cellar holes or stone walls and that sort of thing. And then there might be instances where you do not want to attract attention to historic sites, just people tend to disturb them. There could be impacts, particularly if the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation is concerned about those impacts, you might want to avoid them. Wetlands and soils, again, these are features that are positive in that wetlands are often scenic areas, great places to see birds and other wildlife. But in terms of trail construction, you're going to want to skirt the edges and stay to high and dry soils. And again, soils, as I just mentioned, they vary throughout the property and they can limit or support your trail project depending on their quality.
Great. These are all super important, and Luke and I are, there's a couple slides right now on trail design and layout because designing a trail properly and surveying for things like control points are crucial for creating projects that'll be long lasting, low maintenance, and fun. All of which are really important when we have tight budgets and limited number of people who can get out there on the landscape regularly. So the Vermont Town Forest Trail Design Guide actually has these really great visuals that highlight trail specifications, which is one of the first things you're going to want to do when you're thinking of your trail design and layout is figure out what type of trail you're designing and laying out, and then what those trail specifications are. And trail specifications means the grade, width, and shape that you're aiming for. So you'll know that when you're walking through the woods or doing work from your computer that you're thinking of a quarter width from 4 to 6 feet, a quarter height of 8 feet, and a slope of a certain percentage. So I just screenshotted a handful. They have, I don't know, I want to say at least 10 different trail specifications. So for instance, this is hiking trail moderate, mountain biking moderate, and they also have information on motorized. So here's an example of the snowmobiling. And then once you know your trail specifications, you can start thinking about what Luke and I like to think of as an iterative process, which is the actual trail design and layout, where you're studying available maps and other information that is available to you. So again, ANR Atlas, which we mentioned earlier, is a great resource for this first step, sort of looking for those control points that might be on a map like wetlands or deer wintering areas. Then you draw a few lines in ANR Atlas and you go out into the field and you explore the terrain, see what it looks like when you're out there and if it matches up to what you were thinking. You identify the control points that might exist when you get down into the nitty-gritty of the landscape. Then you can plot potential trail grades, again, according to those specifications that you've already identified by choosing the trail type. You can lay out a preliminary flag line. I'd like to stress that this is definitely just a preliminary flag line. It can help you get an idea of where you're moving through the landscape because you're going to consider ways to enhance trail sustainability, and maybe that means changing that flag line. So you'll go back to your desk and you'll go back to your boots and control points and kind of go through this again a few times and survey subsequent flag lines until you finally stake the final route and create a log that can be followed by a trail crew or contractor to actually get that trail on the ground. And so Luke's going to give us some tips to consider while you're doing all of this, because, you know, you're walking around in the woods and there's no trail that you're walking around. So he'll give us some tips when you're out there.
Sure. And so as you are laying this out, and I think Kathryn mentioned this, it's very important to remember that it's iterative it's going to take many site visits. You may want to get additional input from other people, so you have a second set of eyes or a second opinion out there. And even if you're not flagging a line, if you're out in the woods and you're looking at your trail route and you see an interesting feature, maybe just mark that one stream crossing or that one neat rock outcropping by hanging a flag, especially on a larger parcel. That makes it a lot easier to find that spot when you go back out there later on. So as you're thinking about your lines and your grades and the flow of your trail, we've laid out a few tips, and this is certainly not exhaustive, but in general, you always want to stay to high and dry ground. If you have good soils with good drainage, that is definitely going to benefit your trail in the long haul in terms of reducing erosion and having to avoid building a lot of structures. You can use the natural features like roots and rocks as retainers to hold your trail. And if you root your trail on the uphill side, that's going to provide greater stability. Intersections with trails, streams, and roads, if you can, keep those perpendicular. That is going to be less confusing to trail users, and it's also going to protect those natural features like streams so that you have the shortest possible crossing with the least amount of impact. Along those same lines, if you have a feature like a shoreline or a vista, you might want to consider creating a spur off of your main trail. So again, you have a very point-specific impact on that resource, which is going to be reduced with a spur trail versus running your main trail along the edge of a pond or something like that. You're obviously going to have a greater impact. Very important is to include or incorporate side hills, climbing turns, and grade reversals. We'll talk a little bit more about these later, but generally these three concepts are going to help you create a trail that's sustainable and lightly on the land. It's going to reduce erosion. It's going to reduce channeling of water flow, soil loss, and over time it'll also limit the amount of maintenance that you need to do. So if you can lay your trail out properly using these three features, you're going to save time in the long run in terms of maintenance. Minimizing structures. I know that a lot of us enjoy walking over long sections of boardwalk or bridges and that sort of thing, but it's important to remember that these are expensive, they're costly, they're labor intensive, and they have a lifespan. So if you're looking at a stream crossing and you can install a few flat stepping stones, that's going to last much longer than a log puncheon bridge, which will probably only live for about 10 to maybe 12 or 15 years before it has to be replaced. And those get slippery, they're going to have to be maintained, and they're going to eventually have to be replaced. So looking to minimize those sorts of structures is going to reduce your cost, reduce the amount of time it takes to develop your trail, and I think your trail will be better for it. That's not to say that they aren't needed in some places, but you just want to think twice before you put in a lot of structures. You also want to create some variety. No one likes to walk on a straight trail that's, goes off as far as the eye can see. So use curves and features and work with the landscape to highlight the natural features in the woods. And then you may not want to take the trail past every unique feature on your property. You might want to leave a few things off of the trail and route it away from some natural areas or natural features so that you're leaving a little bit for other people to discover, folks who might enjoy going off trail and places that you might not want to impact as much. And then lastly, just think about the level of challenge. You want your trail to be welcoming to a variety of people, variety of ages and abilities, but at the same time, there may be instances where you do want to provide a level of challenge, and that's okay. So just think about your community and your community goals and what that level of challenge is, and then design your trail accordingly.
Great. So now you know how to design and lay out a trail, and you're wondering, all right, how much time will it take and how much is this going to cost me? Or at least those are what I'm always thinking about. So you There are a few ways you can build a trail. This is a picture right now of the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps. So there's a couple youth corps. The Northwoods Stewardship Center also has a youth corps that does work as well. You can hire a professional builder, or you can use volunteers. And when you're using any type of labor to build something, it's still going to take time and money. So here are a few things that you should think about. Travel time to and from the work site. Are you a mile in because you're building a new trail off of a trail that already exists, or are you right at the road? Tools that you're going to need. Are you going to need to buy new tools? Do you have all the tools? Will the tools needed actually dictate whether or not you can use volunteers or you have to hire professional trail builders? Building materials, are they going to be on site, or do you need to purchase them and transport them to the site? That again then links back to the travel time to and from the work site. Site control during the workday can affect how quickly a crew can work. If you're shutting down a trail so that people won't be walking through the work site, or if it's going to stay open. Site control on the weekends and evenings is a little different than worrying about people interrupting your crew, but it's about keeping that site safe when your crew is not there. Then at the end of the project, how long is it going to take to close out the work site or project area? If you were mining a lot of rocks or cutting down trees on site, the closeout of the work site might take a little bit longer than if you were bringing in materials and or didn't have to use that type of material. Seasonal conditions can also affect production when it gets really cold or if it's raining every day. So those are all things to consider when you're trying to estimate how much time it will take and how much it might cost. And again, at the end, we'll provide resources, and in those resources, there are actually some detailed ways of how you can use these things and then estimate actual weeks of work. And so I think Luke's going to take it away with actually building the trail.
Sure, thanks, Kathryn. And if people do have questions, please feel free again to put them in the chat box, and we will discuss those at the end. I know we're burning through a lot of topics here, but hopefully we can answer them at the end. So as you're getting ready to build your trail, we're going to talk today about two main components. One is the trail corridor, and then the other is the trail tread. The trail corridor is essentially the area through which the trail passes, and that's going to include all of the plants, trees, waters, features on both sides of your trail, generally within a 6 to 12 foot wide swath. Now, you're not necessarily going to remove everything from that swath, but that's sort of the immediate impacts to your trail. So as you have laid out your path, you have a flag line through the forest. You either use pin flags on the ground or flagging tape hanging in trees. You're going to want to establish that trail corridor. And again, different trails have different corridor sizes. If you're building a horse trail, it's going to want to be much taller than you would be building for a regular hiking trail, because the riders are up on a horse. You're going to want to have much higher clearance. If you're skiing, you're going to want a wider trail so that you can allow more space for turning and slowing down versus a hiking trail. So there are some differences here. But generally speaking, your first step is just to go through and trim back the branches and woody vegetation. Again, I'm going to use the term iterative, because I think you would do well to go through with one pass, clear things back, assess how it looks, see what else needs to be done, and then you can make another pass through if you need to remove more live growth or branches. Generally, we've shown here a graphic from the Arbor Day Foundation, which explains how to properly prune branches on trees. And this is an important consideration, because as you lay out your trail corridor, you're really going to try to identify what I call trailside trees, large, healthy, mature trees that are going to be long-lived, and they're going to help define your corridor. And if you can properly prune them, and keep them healthy, it's going to help define your path through the woods. So trees that are in your treadway, that's the path where your feet are on the ground, you're going to want to cut those and pull those stumps. That's just going to prevent future sprouts. It's going to prevent tripping hazards. If it's a medium-sized sapling, sometimes you can cut it at waist height, and that gives you a little bit of a lever or a handle to pry that stump out. Otherwise, you might need to use a root axe or a Pulaski to dig that stump out of the ground. For trees and shrubs and saplings that are on the outsides of your treadway, they're not directly underfoot, you can go ahead and cut those flush to the ground, again, to remove tripping hazards, but you may not need to pull them out entirely. With big trees, I would argue that not only do they define your trail path, but they also provide variety to your trail. And we talked a little bit about the flow of the trail and the layout and using natural features. If you can work your path around large trees, that's great. If you do need to remove a large tree, just think about it, maybe get a second opinion. You can always come back before you take that out. Usually you can work around larger trees with your trail design. So your tread is the area of the trail where your feet or your wheels are in contact with the ground. Again, depending on your trail specification, those widths are going to vary, but generally for a hiking trail, it's anywhere between 12 to 24 inches. You're going to want to mark both sides of the tread, or you can put a flagging right down the middle, but usually that gets removed as you go along. So if you leave those markers on the sides, you can leave those flags in place while you do your construction. You're going to want to get rid of your organic material. We call that duff or duffing when you remove it. And that's the leafy organic matter, twigs and topsoil of the forest. You're going to want to remove that from your trail because that's just going to become squishy, wet mud when it gets wet. And you really want your trail to be set on a firm, solid base. So good mineral soil that's well drained. You can take that organic material and pull it off to the side. You can either pull it to the downhill side of the trail, or if you think you might have to do some restoration later on, you can maybe make little piles of it and then come back and use that to naturalize your work site. Should be another graphic here for tread. Yep, so you've removed your stump. Now you want to shape your trail surface. And again, all trails look different, but this is a graphic from the U.S. Forest Service, which provides some terminology for your trail tread. It includes the main traveled way, the back slope, which is the uphill side of your trail, and then your downslope, the downhill side of your trail. And it shows those two concepts of slough and berm. And the slough is the debris that might flow with gravity down onto the side of your trail, and then the berm that might accumulate on the downhill side of the trail. Generally, you want to use that slough, remove that slough and remove the berm so that water can flow across your pathway in a sheet rather than in a channel. And it would go down your back slope, across the trail, and run off the trail on the downslope in one continuous flow of water that will have the least amount of erosion. And trails can be insloped or outsloped depending on your drainage and your exact site. And I'm getting a little bit into the nitty gritty here, but that's just an example of how you can construct your treadway. All right, so next you have your trail built. You want to provide adequate markings for it. And an old friend of mine always said that a well-marked and well-constructed trail should be easy to follow. You really don't need a whole lot of signs and markings, but particularly with a new trail, I would recommend that you do have some sort of formal marking system. They don't have to be fancy, but they should be consistent. You don't want to overuse signs or markers. Really, you want to focus those at junctions, in areas that are confusing. If you're in a dense stand of trees with lots of corners and it's winding, you might need to use more. If you're in an open forest where you can see well ahead of you, you can use less. So the signs can be made out of any number of materials, hand painted or professionally made. And blazes, they're not in this image here, but generally those are painted markers on trails that are about the size of a dollar bill. Sometimes you can also buy little plastic trail tags. And again, those sort of reinforce the route of the trail in between junctions and waypoints where you have your signage. So again, you don't want to overuse these, but they are helpful, particularly on new trails or areas where it's a little bit denser or tighter or harder to follow. And then lastly, as you think about placing your signs and your blazes, you want to consider it from both directions of travel. People view trails differently depending on the direction in which they're going. And a lot of times you'll see different patterns of use and wear on a trail, depending on whether you're going uphill or downhill. And same thing with signs. You don't want to assume that a sign that is visible from the downhill side is going to be visible from the uphill side as well. You want to take those two different travel directions and mark it out separately. And then when we talk about maps, again, you may not need a map, but if you do think about providing a map, they don't have to be too fancy, but they should be accurate. They should generally be to scale so that people can have reasonable expectations about how long the trail is, where it goes, what the key waypoints and features are. You can use GIS, but it's not necessary. And think about how it's going to be used. Is it something, as in this image, that's posted right on the trail side? Is it something that's on your website? Is it on a kiosk at the trailhead, or is it something you're actually going to print and hand out? Those are all things to consider. They're not mutually exclusive, but you know, there are some expenses involved if you want to make something for a kiosk, or if you're going to be reproducing maps to hand out over and over again. There's a cost to that. So whatever approach you take, it'll probably be specific to your forest, but just some thoughts and ideas as you explore that idea.
Awesome. So now, thanks to Luke, we have a well-signed, well-built trail. And now we have to take care of it. And or maybe you already have trails in your town forest that you do maintain. So this is an overview of some suggestions for maintenance. It's great to schedule volunteers and or staff, depending on how large your town is, to walk trails at least one time per season. This gives you a chance to not only see the trail in all the seasons, but also to allow you to clear drainages 3 times a season, remove blowdowns, check the conditions of infrastructure, and clear the trail corridor. Some common tools that you find when you're doing trail maintenance are loppers. These are great for brushing the trail corridor. You can use a grub hoe or hazel hoe. I know that my old boss preferred to use the hazel hoe, but he had a really long handle, so he didn't have to bend over. Hazel hoes are great because they can move a lot of soil, which is what you're going to be doing when you're clearing drainages and removing those berms that Luke mentioned that can form on the outside of the trail tread. You can also use brush saws and bow saws to clear small branches, and they can also be used for clearing modest-sized logs from trails. I really like folding saws, and then these silky, what are they called again, Luke? The saws that don't fold? The silky
fixed blade.
The fixed blade. I just carry it around. I don't know the technical term, so thanks. And they can, I say that they cut through modest-sized logs from trails like butter. Then you can also use a swizzle stick, which can clear herbaceous vegetation from the trail corridor. So this might be good if you have a trail that's going through a field or something, and it's just swung back and forth with both of your hands. There are work gloves that come in all kinds of sizes and colors, and so if you choose ones that you're comfortable with, you're probably going to wear them. I also wanted to note that all the tools listed here aren't exhaustive. and they're not mandatory. You might find that you have tools that you like better, as long as you're using them in the safe way that's suggested by the manual. Tools that you enjoy using are probably just as good as these. Luke was telling me about an old timer he sees out with a frame backpack and a garden hoe and garden rake because they're lighter, so he's able to cover more ground and clear more drainages. So again, you'll get used to what you like, and as long as you're out there doing the work, that's what counts. This is just an example.
Oh, Kathryn, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. We're just at 10:40, just to let you know.
Okay, so that means I have 5 minutes?
5 to 10 minutes to finish up, and then we could do some questions.
All right, excellent. Thanks for the reminder. So I just wanted to show, this is a picture of what a trail corridor would look like before you have done your maintenance. And you can see the outlines are the trail tread or the trail corridor. And all the numbers highlight some issues. So there's branches, a down log, brush, and a berm. And then this person has gone through and cleared all of those. So you can see that all the numbers match up with the before picture, but show what has been cleared. And so that's sort of what you're going for when you're going out there once a season, is to ensure that you continually have a clear tread and corridor, because I don't mean to mix up the words tread and corridor, but they're so intricately linked, because if you don't have a clear corridor, people can actually sort of change where the tread might go. If people are getting hit in the face with brush and branches from the uphill side of a trail, they might actually sort of pull the tread downhill as they try to avoid it. So it's really important to do all of this maintenance regularly, because subtle things happen over time that might not be apparent. Yep. So then Luke's going to tell us about clearing drainages.
Sure. And I think there's some interesting stories about trail creep and the impacts of not properly brushing out your trail. And I won't get into them, but the trails do move, and they're largely dictated by the habits of hikers. In terms of drainages, besides brushing, I would say water is one of the most important considerations on your trail. And so this can be approached differently depending on whether you are developing a trail from scratch or if you're coming in and maintaining an existing trail. And a lot of times those decisions are already made for you on an existing trail. But when you're laying out a new trail, you really have a great opportunity to use some key concepts to make it more sustainable. The term that we have here is a rolling grade dip. And that has a lot of different names. There's a Coweta dip, a nick, or just a grade dip. But if you look closely at the slide, you'll see that it's an area, it's a low spot that's 10 feet wide. It's not just a tiny little drainage, it's a low point in the trail where the path goes down gently into a low point, the water flows off the path, and then on the other side, the trail rises again and continues on. These are going to want to be installed, and same with water bars, which I'll talk about in a second here. More of them or more frequently, the steeper your trail is. If your trail is generally pretty modest or moderate in slope, you may not need many, but the steeper it is, the more you want. And again, I would refer you to the resources that we'll provide at the end for some real concrete details on these. The second one that many of you have seen, particularly if you're on backcountry trails like the Long Trail, trails that have been around for quite a while, they've seen a lot of use, they've seen a lot of erosion, and they're fairly set in their location, are water bars. And water bars are basically a beefier version of a rolling grade dip, except that you may not have the benefit of using the natural grade. And that's why I say, when you're laying out your trail, if you can use that grade to create those rolling dips, that's ideal. A lot of times water bars are placed on trails that have already been sited and constructed. You can't use the terrain as much as you'd like, and so it's a little bit more of a forceful way of diverting the trail. And I use that term a little loosely because you really don't want to force the water. You want to coerce it off the trail. You want that water to flow out with the least amount of interruption in its flow. Water transports sediment, and the fault with most drainage structures is that if they're not maintained or constructed properly, water will deposit sediment over time in your drainage and it'll stop working. So with your water bar, you have an apron which collects the water, diverts it to the edge of the trail. You actually have the physical bar, which can be made of stone, of logs, or soil. And then you also have your outlet, which you can see in this graphic is 2 shovel widths wide. So I would highly recommend that you overbuild these structures. You make them wider, longer, deeper than you might expect is necessary, because over time they will fill in. And your real goal is to create a water bar that is going to self-clean. It's going to maintain the velocity of that water. The water is going to continue to flow off the trail with all of the sediment and debris and leaves and flush itself out during a rainstorm. You don't want that water to slow down so much that it deposits that material, because that's going to lead to maintenance issues and plugs. And a really key point here, and it's expressed in the graphic, is that your water bar wants to be at a minimum of 45 degrees, and it could go anywhere between 45 and 60 degrees of the trail. Any less, then you're really creating a little bit of a bump for the water. It could skip right over it, or it could slow down so much that, again, it deposits material in the tread. So Kathryn's going to talk a little bit about maintaining structures next, and then we'll wrap it up.
All right. Thanks, Luke. When I was building trail, I always like to imagine, like, I stand there and I'm like, be the water, which might not work for everybody, but that's how I like think about it when I'm thinking about water. And think how you might move down the trail. So condition of infrastructure is also really important. Like Luke mentioned way earlier, the easiest way to maintain the condition of your infrastructure is to have a good design and layout and to minimize the infrastructure that you have. Accurately assessing the conditions of bridges and other structures is important. And one way that you can do it with wood structures is by sticking the blade of a pocket knife into a wood structure, which can give you a general sense of whether the timber is suffering from significant rot. And the picture that I have here is actually, that's a putty knife, and it's a 3-inch putty knife. And so it's about 2 to 2.5 inches into the stringer of a bridge. So when that sort of thing happens, that's when you might want to start considering, is this happening in all the stringers? How many stringers are there? You have to start thinking long-term of if you need to close it, if you have to close a bridge, how will that affect your trail, etc. It also, doing this regularly gives you time to plan, because like Luke mentioned prior, building infrastructure like bridges and turnpike, etc. is usually expensive. So it's good to regularly check these so that you know a handful of years ahead of time what your budget might need to be to actually replace these structures. And then there's also rock structures that you can test. And we like to say that you can test rock structures by dancing on them. So this just actually means, you can like jump up and down, because rocks should be set in a way that they don't move. So if they're wiggly, that can be an indicator that they might move or fall out of place and cause more damage to your infrastructure or tread. You want to inspect any walls that you might have for indications that rocks are working loose. You can examine the bottom tier specifically, because that's, those are your base stones, your keystones, and they're keeping the rest of the wall up. And then you can maybe restore the level of fill material behind walls and inside crib steps. There's nothing like sort of walking up a set of crib steps that you can see the lip of, and then you step into sort of nothingness. I've fallen doing that, but that's okay. And then Luke's gonna take it. I don't know if he has any more comments about the wood structures or rock structures, but if he doesn't, we're gonna move on to sustainability and stewardship.
Sure. And so when we talk about structures, this actually ties really well into sustainability, because as you're developing your trail, it's going to grow over time. It's going to change over time. You may not have all the options available to you at the outset. So, we talk about complementing landscape, not having, conflicting and having to do a lot of excavation, a lot of retaining walls and that sort of thing. So working with the land, that's going to make it more sustainable, and always thinking about alternatives. With the discussion about bridges or structures, you may not realize that there are alternatives until after you've built them, but when it comes time to replace them, maybe in 10 or 15 years, you might realize that there's a more suitable location for your trail. And it might be easier to move the trail out of its location rather than go ahead and replace a number of bridges or a bunch of structures. It's always great, as I mentioned earlier, to get a second opinion. Try to incorporate those natural lines and curves to give it diversity and flow. Think about your future maintenance. If you can build in those drainage structures, those dips and grade reversals early on, it's going to reduce your future maintenance. And then, again, progressing towards sustainability. Like I said, trails change over time, and it's a process, not an event, to make your trail sustainable. So, each time you go out there, if you can make it more sustainable, make continuous improvements, it will get better over time. Think about when you're making your trail or you're doing anything that has a significant impact. We talked about the duff early on. You want to think about site restoration. Can you use that leaf litter to cover up the raw soils that might be exposed when you're putting in a step or a bridge? Can you really naturalize a section of trail that you've had to close or relocate around? There's a lot of things that you can do using natural debris that's just out there in the forest to make your trail edge, or particularly your work sites, naturalize a lot more quickly. Vermont does have a Vermont trail ethic, which is a great guiding principle, not so much for trail construction, but for trail users, so that when they go out there, they know how to respectfully use the land, respect others, and tread lightly. And then in terms of sustainability, again, we mentioned this early on, but your community investment in your volunteers. It's really hard to maintain a trail on your own. And so, a part of social sustainability is to keep people involved and try to recruit volunteers and try to have activities and get young people involved so that they can help share the load moving forward.
All right, and finally, we're gonna do safety and risk management. And I have this set up on a spectrum because I feel like your staff and frequent volunteers might need a higher level of safety and risk management than your visitors. So down over at your staff or frequent volunteers, you might make the investment of having wilderness first aid training. You can go over personal protective equipment at the beginning of each volunteer day. You do what's called all I can think of is this trailhead session, but that's not what I mean. Tailgate session, where you go over all of the possible risks of the day. So if it's hot out like today is, you want to make sure that everyone has water and is drinking it and has enough. And so it can be as simple as that. It doesn't always have to be, does everyone have their chainsaw chaps and everything? Because maybe it's a day where you don't need chainsaw chaps, but you need water and food because you're going to be out in the field for 8 hours. So that all happens with the staff and frequent volunteers. And then also the tailgate session should occur with one-day volunteers or people who aren't there as often. The 10 essentials are really great too. That's a good way to introduce new volunteers to things that they should always just be prepared to have with them when they're out on the trail working. This includes a first aid kit, extra clothes, sun protection, etc. And then for visitors, the 10 essentials are important, but also the leave no trace principles and the Vermont trail ethic, as Luke mentioned previously. The leave no trace principles do highlight planning ahead and preparing.
Oh, Kathryn, you keep cutting in and out for me. Are you guys?
Oh, really? I guess, I don't know if anybody, well, this was the last thing I was going to say. Can you hear me now?
Oh, Kathryn?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can hear her. And so
Kathryn
yes,
and Luke, if you guys can hear me, Kathryn keeps cutting out.
that's fine. I can pick it up from here and just say that, safety and risk management occurs across a spectrum, and it's just an underlying concern that you should always be aware of and always try to share with the public and the people who are helping you. The last slide is a list of resources.
Luke, I think you've cut out too.
Hey, Gwen, this is Kate. I'll jump in, and I can hear Luke okay. So, Luke, if you just want to walk us through the resources, and then
Are you there?
we do have. Oh,
okay.
We do have a few questions that have come in. So, Luke, do you want to walk us through the resources?
Yeah, sorry for the technical glitches here. Yeah, the resources, this is certainly not exhaustive, but we have provided a list of some of the more commonly used guidebooks for trail maintenance. I won't list them all, but they include some from the Student Conservation Association, the U.S. Forest Service, Appalachian Mountain Club, as well as some user-specific guides. IMBA is the International Mountain Biking Association. There's also an equestrian handbook put out by the U.S. Forest Service. NOVAC is an off-road vehicle guidebook. So both for general and specific uses, there are tons of resources out there. And then at the bottom of your page, there's a list of some of the links that you will have access to here in Vermont and New England. And any number of those groups are willing to, give you consultation, do site visits, or do contracted crew work as needed. But I highly recommend you revisit these. They're always great sources of information, and it's fun to compare and contrast, and also to go back and just see and revisit some of the topics that you think you might already know, but there's always a little bits that you can pick up here and there. So yeah, I think that does conclude our presentation. Thanks everybody. Hopefully Kathryn is with us again.
I don't know, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Great. So there are a few questions. Gwen, do you want to facilitate that?
Yeah. Hey, Luke, it's Kate again, and I apologize again, folks, for all the technical difficulties. And it is what it is, right, with webinars in Vermont and internet connections. But we do, Luke and Kathryn, we do have a number of questions that have come in, and so let me just throw a few of those to you. We do have a few more minutes for questions. Let's see here. The first one is from Richard. Back, Luke, when you were talking about trail building, he asks that he's heard some builders use tail logs to help define the trail tread. Does anyone else use these instead of flags?
I'm not familiar with that term. I don't know if Kathryn is.
I'm not familiar with it either.
I do know that in some cases, if a trail takes a sudden turn that might be difficult to mark otherwise, you can use logs on the edge to direct people. However, I would caution that you don't want those logs to interfere with drainage. And I also don't want to overuse those logs because people don't want to feel like they're being herded. But if you can use them here and there to define your path, I do think that's an appropriate approach. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but hopefully so.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke. And another question from John. He says, I'm hearing recommendations from several sources about not intentionally digging back to create backslope on the uphill side of the trail. Just dig a vertical edge and then let the edge seek its own natural angle over time. I think the idea is to preserve as much of the organic material and root structure on the uphill side. He says most of the comments that he's hearing about this are with respect to creating forest access trails for firewood harvesting, etc. So these trails would likely be wider than a typical hiking trail. However, the trails are dual purpose. And he goes on, so I guess any thoughts on that practice of digging a vertical edge to create a back slope on the uphill side of the trail?
Yeah, I tend to avoid that, but I may not be understanding it adequately, but generally on your back slope, the term I use is angle of repose, and you're going to find a natural angle for that back slope where the organic matter will stay in place, where seeds will germinate, where sort of the forest soils will essentially regenerate and heal themselves. If you make that back slope too steep, what tends to happen is that the mineral soils at the base of the back slope will wash out, and you'll get sort of an overhang with roots that is just never going to regenerate and heal over. There are two ways to go about building a side hill trail. One is a partial bench construction, where half of your trail is made of mineral soil and the other half native mineral soil, and then the other half is made from soil that you've excavated from your back slope. And then the other version is a full bench construction, where your entire path has been excavated out of the side hill, and it has a full width mineral soil. It's a little bit more intensive. It requires more space. And both situations, you really want to keep track of your upslope and back slope to make sure that that soil is stable and ideally revegetated with, you know, natural woody debris and duff. Again, I don't know if that answered the question, but I hope so. Kathryn,
Yeah, great. Let me just build on that, because there's a couple of questions in here about using old logging roads to minimize footprint. Any thoughts on any advice or thoughts on cutting a series of switchbacks and sort of how to handle the use of old forestry or logging access roads for trails?
I feel like I was always taught to not do that, and then the trails seem to always end up on them anyways. I don't.
Yeah, my thought
answer
is
the question.
that,
I just go for it, Luke.
Well, you know, skid trails are built for skidders, not for hikers. And a lot of times when you're following a logging trail, you're really hemmed in by ruts on both sides or high banks on both sides, where it'll be difficult to divert the water. And again, if you're doing that, your path has already been determined for you, and you don't have the flexibility of putting the trail where you want it. That's not to say that when you're laying out your trail, if you can hop onto a section of forest road or a skid trail for a while, that's sustainable and well drained and works with your design, that's great. You may need to use a little bit more care in the transition between your footpath and the skidder road, so that people don't continue walking off
the skidder road.
Yep, it sounds like we might have lost Luke there, Kathryn.
Yep, but I agree what he was saying. He was going to say fall off the skidder road. Like you might, you want to make sure that people are going to like notice that the trail has left the skidder road and they're now on a sort of single track, if you will. Yep.
Okay.
I don't know what else he was going to say, but I know that that's what he was going to say. Sorry if you can hear meowing. My cat just woke up.
Excellent. Well, thank you both again so much for sharing so much information with us today. I know I personally learned a whole lot in the presentation, and I even Googled the swizzle stick. Is that what you call it for removing vegetation?
Stick, yeah.
Swizzle stick, yeah. I'm looking forward to checking that out. Lots of new terms and tools, and just overall excellent presentation. Thank you both, Luke and Kathryn, for taking the time to join us today. And thank you, everybody, for your participation in the webinar today. We are over 11 o'clock, so I know there are a few more questions in the question box, but what I'll do is I'll send some of these questions to Luke and Kathryn, and maybe if you don't mind following up with resources, there's a couple questions about recommendations for wilderness first aid training and first aid kits, and a few other, I think, sort of easy questions that could be addressed by email. Would that work for you, Kathryn?
Yep.
And Luke?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you both again for taking the time to join us today and sharing all of this information. Clearly, folks have a lot of interest in this topic, and a lot of folks out there building and maintaining trails, which is super, super exciting. So again, thank you all the participants for being with us this morning. And we do have our final webinar scheduled for next week, where we'll be diving into mountain bike trails. And we'll be hearing from a few folks on building and maintaining mountain bike trails in Vermont and town forests, as well as a community story from Marshfield, learning a little bit about their community experience in building sustainable mountain bike trails. So with that, I thank you. And then also actually just a reminder to folks that at the end of the webinar this morning, you'll get a pop-up survey. Please go ahead and complete that to give us feedback both on the webinar today, but also ideas and suggestions for future topics. And Gwen Kozlowski will be following up with an email to folks with with a link to the recording for the webinar today, as well as some of the resources and questions that were asked in the question box that we weren't able to get to. All right, I think that's it for today, everybody. And what a beautiful day to get out and hit a trail. So hope everybody finds one close by. And thank you again for joining us. Thanks again, Luke and Kathryn.
Thank you.
Thank you.